my pleasure to introduce Franklin Sirmans, the department head and the curator of LACMA's Contemporary Art Collection. Before taking up his position at LACMA, Sirmans was the curator of modern and contemporary art at the Manual Collection in Houston, where he organized, among other works, New Hoodoo, Art for a Forgotten Faith. This experimental exhibition, co-organized with PS1 back in 2008, focused on ritual and spirituality in Pan-American art practices, showcasing such artists like Ana Mendieta, Adrian Piper, and Jose de Dia. As a scholar on the works of Basquiat, he also co-curated a show in 2006 for the Brooklyn Museum on Basquiat works. This exhibition was also seen in Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art and the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. Sirmans is also the artistic director of Prospect 3, the New Orleans biennial that this year is taking on subjects like crime and punishment, movie-going, the carnivalesque, abstraction, visual sound, and the South itself. Many of these themes have been of particular interest in our MFA program this semester, and I'm delighted to have Mr. Sirmans with us today. Join me in welcoming Franklin Sirmans.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Hi everybody, thank you for coming. I guess I had to come because Hale Steiner asked me to come. And I don't know where my head was, but I just got back from like a month away in New Orleans, and I was like, yeah, sure. And now I'm like, so I'm still kind of trying, I'm still like a little bit getting back into the flow. And so I guess that's a good place to start, would be this most recent exhibition. And I mean, you guys have so many esteemed people around you. I'm just like looking across the room and feeling like, you know, I've seen the work in the place where I work, so it's nice to see you guys here and in this way. And I was told that it's a very casual type of thing, so I'd like to keep that in mind. I hope you keep that in mind. And if you have questions, we make this dialogue. I think I have like 2 spots in which to start or whatever. So I'll start here with the most recent, and then maybe talk a little bit about LACMA stuff. And I think it offers some sort of parallel discussion, or I don't know if it's parallel or not, but especially in light of today, I think it can be interesting for you guys and the conversation you're having while you're still in school, and maybe, you know, in light of yesterday being election day, yeah, it reminds me that like we talk often about the biennial type exhibitions being this place where you can have certain conversations that you might not have in the institution. And interestingly, I find myself able to address that conundrum well at this point. There's also a wonderful exhibition up at LACMA now called Variations, Conversations in and Around Abstract Painting, which is like probably almost a polar opposite, I think, in some ways from the exhibition in New Orleans, although there is some overlap artist-wise. But I think it's I don't know, it's something interesting, food for thought. And what else am I saying before I begin? I don't know, I'm just on that obviously we're all on that political thing after yesterday, right?
It's a hard word.
Yeah. So I guess we can go ahead. Yeah, so as I was saying, okay, I'll talk about this. We'll try to do that, give you a taste of this exhibition, like 30 minutes or so, and then try to open up for some conversation. And if you want me to backtrack on images or anything, we could do that too. Prospect is an exhibition that began in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. It was founded by Dan Cameron. The first one happened in 2008. We call it a biennial, I think, as shorthand for a type of exhibition, not trying to be so literal as many knucklehead critics have mentioned in the last couple of weeks. It's not that it has to happen every 2 years. Okay, so we're probably going to call it a triennial soon. But for the sake of the conversation, that kind of show is what Dan was thinking about. And he was thinking about Venice, going back to the 19th century. He was thinking very much about Sao Paulo in the middle of the 20th century. He was thinking about Documenta, shortly before that. And he was thinking about these types of exhibitions. I think Documenta in particular, you can cite, and then more importantly for me, probably Johannesburg, Istanbul, Gwangju. These exhibitions that came to prominence, let's say in the mid-90s, around a discussion of globalism, of internationalism in contemporary art. And I think, I find as a curator, Dan's work prescient, especially around that time, because as somebody who was born and raised in New York, I was working at the Center for the Arts in the early 90s. Part of a pretty interesting conversation, but if you went to the galleries in Soho, or even the 2 or 3 that were in Chelsea at that point, you didn't necessarily have the same kind of conversation you were going to have in Europe, or in Africa, or in Asia at that time, which I think was a much more international conversation. And New York was slow to catch up to that. And that's probably one of the reasons why in 2008 he could even say, and this is another one where people can stickle a little bit, but you can even say that that prospect could be an American biennial. That's part of this conversation. And there's the Whitney, there's the Carnegie, but I think there's a little bit different. So it was founded on that premise. So when I was given the opportunity, I was excited to take that opportunity. And I felt like New Orleans in particular, for me, really resonated. I did a show 2008, as you mentioned, called Neobudu, which drew in part from the cultural space of New Orleans. It was a show that tried to look at spirituality, but in a very American way, or this side of the Atlantic way, this hemisphere, not American in terms of the United States, but in terms of the Americas, and was interested, I think, in sort of the way that Catholicism from Europe and Yoruban religion from West Africa gets syncretized in this hemisphere. So like Santeria in Cuba, or Candomblé in Brazil, Vodun in Haiti, or Voodoo in New Orleans. And then all of the many ways that Catholicism feeds into that, and then it becomes this syncretic thing. So that space was interesting to me, and I was very adamant about the opportunity, and luckily, after some cajoling, I guess, was my director, Michael Govin, was also supportive of the idea. And I was, in order to make that work, I think, for us also as an institution, I was advised in the process by Rita Gonzalez and Christine Kim, who many of you know, from my department. So it made it a conversation that we were already having, like on a weekly basis, to a conversation that just turned a little bit. So it became possible, I think, in that way. And then if you see the catalog, there are like probably 10 of the 30 contributors are somehow affiliated with LACMA. So it also, I think, is a way to think about these type of exhibitions. When I was first considering these shows in the early mid-90s, it was a time when like the idea of the independent curator, through, I guess, the foundation of someone like Harold Zeman, who many people would say would be the first of this independent curator, was very much a topic of conversation. And I think a lot of them got jobs after, but the emphasis on them being independent at that time was really a part of the conversation. And I'm thinking of people like Rosa Martinez, Francesco Bonami. I don't think Carlos Basualdo was working in an institution at that time. So it was this Okwi Enwezer, it was this conversation that was very specific. And I think that now, for me, it was a really interesting way in which to involve both the institution and a more independent support structure, which is what Prospect is. With that in mind, I felt like the exhibition had to do two things in order to be relatively successful, was that it had to address its context, specifically its location, like what are you telling us about that given space? And then in an opposite way, it also had to be about an international conversation around contemporary art and ideas that, you know, probably is in conversation with Documenta, with Venice, with more recently Taipei or Guangzhou just opened, or Sao Paulo. I feel we had a lot of conversations with Sao Paulo, with Charles Mary Levitt, and also Weingarten with the last Berlin biennial. So it had to be able, you know, to talk about things in that way as well. And so I needed a way to find some sort of structure for that. And I guess the idea of trying to think about how to make the show was, for me personally, some sort of a search. And it related in a way like I'm always reading books and thinking about that as a jump off point. And then I was in a studio visit because of the third part of that, two things that hopefully make it successive, is listening to artists. And just for the first year and a half, going to studio visits and just trying to get feedback about what's on your mind, what you're doing. And in the course of one of those studio visits, somebody was like, you need to read this book, The Moviegoer. So The Moviegoer came out in 1961, takes place all in New Orleans in the Gulf Coast of the United States. Centers around this character, Binks Bowling, in the week before his 30th birthday, so he's kind of on this search for himself. It automatically puts us in the landscape of New Orleans, and it puts us there in a very, I think, poetic and atmospheric way. Because we're not trying to be didactic, we're not trying to show you the exact thing, but I was hoping that the poetry of a book like that would translate, at least for me, as inspiration. And again, it's not like there's references to the book in the work that's in the show or anything, but I think it's a way in. I think it's a way of understanding. The book is small, and yet packed a very powerful punch in 1961, 1962. It was the National Book Award winner in 1962. It beat out books by authors we know, like Malamud, Joseph Heller, Catch-22, Revolutionary Road, J.D. Salinger, Franny and Zoe was that year. Beat out all those books. And written by Walker Percy, an author who, I think I read a little bit, but didn't know very well. Author who was born in Alabama, raised in Mississippi, died in Louisiana, so very much about the South. His uncle was a poet. He was very much in awe of William Faulkner, spoke about the time he finally got to meet him and actually couldn't speak. So he was steeped in this Southern literary tradition, but he was also very curious. And he ended up being interested in existentialism just as much as he was in the Southern literature. Studied Camus, Sartre, Kierkegaard, and became known as a Southern existentialist, if you will. So it was like, in a way, for me, it was like, this is a perfect thing to sort of keep in mind, and it does those things. It locates us squarely in this place, and yet the conversation is big enough and open enough to be about something more. So if one could say that the character was on this search and that there's a curatorial search happening, what I think happens in the book, and people read it differently, is that the main character begins to understand himself by his relations to other people. At the beginning of the book, he does not necessarily see everyone around him. By the end of the book, he has a certain clarity because he can see people more fully. For example, there's a butler early on in the movie. So 1961 New Orleans, obviously, he's in a big, rich, old family. So obviously the butler is black. And so he's kind of this person who's there at all times. He knows everything about everybody in the family, but they know nothing about him because they don't really see him. So by the end of the book, Binks and this character kind of see each other. So this idea of seeing each other in the self, and I think it was, what's her name from Artifact City? Yeah. I mean, if you were in New York, we would all know. But
Hattie Johnson.
thank you. And she was saying something to the extent of, okay, so the crux of the show is seeing each other in ourselves. And I would agree with that, but I think that my preamble before that is just as important. And she did this, so. The idea, so then, right, as a curator, as artist, then where is the visual entry point? And so it just, I don't know, it became obvious, and I'll admit in some ways cliche, but the idea that I kept returning to was these shows are all there to do the same thing, which is who are we, what are we, where are we going? Which relates to this big, important Gauguin painting from 1898 that's in the collection of the Boston MFA. And the painting has traveled extensively. It rarely leaves the museum. It would have been nice. That didn't happen. We had a nice, like little things that in the process had to come into play in terms of luck and fate. And there are a series of glass doors that Gauguin did when he second trip to Tahiti in 1893. That he painted of these same sort of exotic, well not exoticized because I don't truly believe that, but these figures that he encountered in Tahiti. And he supposedly painted them on these glass doors in order to provide some degree of privacy when he was there. And so they happen to be in the collection of the New Orleans Museum of Art. So it was just too easy to follow this direction. There's also another sort of anecdotal story, believe it or not, which is that Edgar Degas, who spent 2 years in New Orleans in the 1870s, and knew Gauguin was like, you should go to New Orleans. You should really explore New Orleans. I think it'd be great for you. And of course he didn't, but the story is there. And there's a Degas museum right down the street from the New Orleans Museum of Art. So there's a conversation that's there in some fashion. So we had the glass doors at the museum. And from the very beginning, I think, for better or worse, the idea with the exhibition in New Orleans, and I would say perhaps a little bit less so in Documenta and a little bit less so in Venice, where you have two very specific sites. I'm cheating on that. They're all about this. They're about the city. They're about making use of the city. They're about forcing you to have different encounters with not only art, but with people, with the city itself. And so that was very much a part of this project from the beginning. We ended up with 18 different venues. I do believe that at least 80% can be seen between 4 venues. So it sounds more spread out than it is when you say 18, but then you take into account solo projects that are unto themselves, that are site-specific unto themselves. But I think 80% of the work can be seen in 4 venues. So this idea of seeing oneself in the other, there was a visual component that played in the work of Gauguin, and also a search component in the work of Gauguin. Artist who was born in Peru, who traveled very much because of his parents at an early age, and was a seeker. Where he went with that seeking in terms of finding himself in a quote-unquote exotic other is another conversation. But this idea of search and trying to find oneself, leaving Paris at the time that it is the center of activity, I think is interesting. And then it was important to not only locate that visual point in Europe, but back in our hemisphere. And so another artist who was approaching ideas of finding oneself is Tarsila do Amaral. And born 20 years later, born and lived in Brazil. And Tarsila was part of a group of artists and intellectuals in the 20s and 30s who were sort of charged with this idea of trying to identify a Brazilian self or a Brazilian identity. This is Brasilia, I forget what year Brasilia the capital is, but still talking about a young country in this way of being on the quote-unquote international stage. And the way that they sought to identify themselves as Brazilian was to embrace all of the others. Brazil also being built upon slavery, so you have this history of Africa, of Europe, and of a native culture. And so this idea played out in what was called the Cannibalist Manifesto, which was written by Tarsila's husband, a guy named Oswald de Andrade. And this idea that in order to show our true self, we must eat all of ourselves, and that is the only way we can present ourselves truly as Brazilian to the world. So somebody who is looking to identify in a way and see oneself. And so that was the sort of historical conversation that I thought was interesting. Tarsila was also a focal point of the 1986 Sao Paulo biennial of Europe and of a native culture. And so this idea played out in what was called the Cannibalist Manifesto, which was written by Tarsila's husband, a guy named Oswald de Andrade. And this idea that in order to show our true self, we must eat all of ourselves, and that is the only way we can present ourselves truly as Brazilian to the world. So somebody who is looking to identify in a way and see oneself. And so that was the sort of historical conversation that I thought was interesting. Tarsila was also a focal point of the 1986 Sao Paulo biennial. And it was one of the few times, I think, where she played much of a role in terms of an international contemporary conversation. The work comes out of a modernist trajectory, and at the New Orleans Museum, we have her work in a role in a room with Picasso, with Grieg, with Modigliani. Geez, can't say that today. $100 million. Art wasn't 70. But it was about putting these artists into a different context. And I think some people get lost in terms of experiencing the exhibition in the New Orleans Museum of Art because it's just as much about all the other work that's in there. And it hopefully engenders a conversation that I thought was important to the biennial project in the United States, which was how do we consider art in our museums, which is what we talk about all the time at LACMA. And I got to thinking, and not only do you have the historical work here, but then you also have some contemporary artists at the New Orleans Museum of Art, and one of them got me looking really closely again at the history of MoMA very, very early on. And to think about that as like our vehicle, our whatever, post-Armory show, almost 20 years later, vehicle into an American avant-garde. The interesting thing I found in going back to that history and looking at some of the lists of exhibitions is how many of those exhibitions are about people. And so you have exhibitions in the 40s, well, 1941, Native American art. 35, I think, is African art, or African and Afro-American. They put it together, which is really interesting because that continuation or that bridge between Africa and Africans in the New World is so often seen as broken because of slavery. So they were doing exhibitions like that, Asian art, like, big, ridiculous thematic exhibitions on people. And so you even have William Edmondson, who's this guy who was self-taught, worked with Stone in Tennessee, has a solo show, black guy, has a solo show at MoMA in the early 40s. And it's not, it's not like a big deal. It's just part of the conversation. And it was shown with a lot of photography. It's about discovering, I think, again, people. So that history, of course, changes with the war and avant-garde American tradition and abstract expressionism. But it was a real core of how people experienced avant-garde museum experience, at least in New York, for the first time in the 1930s and early 40s. And New Orleans Museum of Art, although founded in 1911, is a part of that conversation. It began to be, the city's temple of culture, of the place where people could go and learn about things that weren't just a part of themselves. So that very much is a foundation, if you will. this idea of seeing each other and the other, and then taking it from a literary viewpoint to a visual viewpoint via these two artists. And then there were other artists that were just so obviously a part of the conversation that I couldn't ignore it. So Jean-Michel Basquiat, what began as a conversation around 2 or 3 paintings, and not these 3, was taken further by the director of Prospect, my director, Brooke Davis Anderson, who I know from 20 years ago in New York and who worked here at Lackman for a little while. She took it further and was like, let's make this a show. Let's make this a show with its own book. And so it developed into something completely different. But the reason and what pointed me in the direction of his work and having done the thesis and knowing that there was a body of work that just specifically talked about this region, and in every way, culturally, musically, spiritually, religiously, it's all there. And he experienced that from a point of remove. Artist who's born in Brooklyn, raised in Brooklyn, mother's Puerto Rican, father's Haitian, so maybe has an interest in finding himself in this territory. All of the work that he did prior to 1983 is, I would have to say, comes from just intuition and interest. In 1983, Robert Farris Thompson wrote a book called Flash of the Spirit, and that book, very important book, became a sort of Bible for Basquiat around that time. Written by Robert Farris Thompson. The two of them had a very strong bond and conversation between 83 and 85. And did an essay together for the exhibition catalog in 1984 at Mary Boone Gallery. And it was the first time that somebody really talked about the work in terms of that trajectory again, from, say, a more Afro-Atlantic approach, rather than just graffiti, neo-expressionism, royalty, heroism in the streets, as Jeffrey Deitch called it. And he made this sort of big historical conversation that took things in a much bigger direction. And then later, the conversation gets bigger. But it was a fruitful conversation, and there are like 20, 30 works that explore this thematic. So it seemed obvious. There's a painting called Undiscovered Genius of the Mississippi Delta. There's another painting called Revised Undiscovered Genius of the Mississippi Delta. It says Mark Twain on the bottom. There's like catfishing. It's like directly out of the book. It's just so there. And of course, auctions are really on the mind too today. But Undiscovered Genius of the Mississippi Delta, which from the time that it was made in 1983 until last summer, last May, was in the collection of Peter Brandt in Connecticut. And say what you will about Peter Brandt, but he's a great lender. And so he'll give you a Basquiat painting, anything, wherever you're going to be. And he was game for the conversation, but the market intervenes. So he sells the painting at Sotheby's in May, and it goes into the hands of a Swiss collector who, for a month, said that they were going to participate, and then decided that they didn't want to participate. So the center painting of this whole, now we have a whole floor, basically, dedicated to this show. The center painting goes out. Okay, I'm mad about it, but luckily, right down the street in Switzerland, Bruno Bischofberger, who has some of the best work, has Zydeco. And Zydeco is huge, and it's hardly ever left his collection since it was made. And so it's beautiful, it's in pristine condition, and that became the centerpiece of the exhibition. It's called Zydeco. I mean, it's like as close as I can get from Undiscovered Genius of the Mississippi Delta. The music is the music of Louisiana. It's music that is created by the perhaps cultural collision of the accordion as an object coming to the Americas. So in New Orleans, in Louisiana, you get Zydeco. In Peru, you get cumbia. In Mexico, you get, I'm forgetting what it's called. So it's another thing that does this sort of conversation and widens the conversation. There are also a lot of other elements in that piece, but to have it there in New Orleans, I think, was very specific. And the other part about fate and in terms of the project is that Basquiat actually finally did go to New Orleans in the spring of 1988 to attend Jazz Fest, which is this big music festival. So there was that story as well. Music, Zydeco, jazz, King Zulu, painting from 1986 that's in the collection of the Museum in Contemporary Art in Barcelona, and has been seen in Europe a lot, but was not part of our survey in 2005. And it's a direct reference to Louis Armstrong, the biggest jazz musician ever born in New Orleans. He also happened to be king of the Zulu crew in 1949 at Mardi Gras. So the links were just all there. Also the fact that the King Zulu, or the Zulu crew, is actually black people putting on blackface and playing with that history of vaudeville and sort of taking it and making it their own in a way, is also interesting. But in the space of the painting, you know, there is that question again of blackface, of vaudeville, of wearing masks, which is also, I think, another important strain of the show. 1988, Eshu, spirituality to the hilt. So specifically calling out the god of the crossroads, Eshu, coming directly from Yoruba religion, and in this case spelled E-X-U, which I think is, relates to Cuba, and also is the same god as Legba, is this trickster, often called the trickster god, who is the bridge between life and death. And this painting is another one of those weird, it's one of two weird paintings that he made in 1988, shortly before he died, where the other one is called Riding with Death. And so you have these two end points that he seemed to foretell. So we got that painting. All of these paintings are from Europe. This one is in Paris. So the work is out there, and it became this cornerstone part of the exhibition. And Robert Ferris Thompson then wrote a new essay for the catalog in which he talked about his time talking to the artist and that moment in 83, 84 when they met. The other thing that happens, I think, at the New Orleans Museum of Art is that all of the artists that I mentioned initially are working in a figurative or representational style, and I think that abstraction is just as much of the conversation as that. And Ed Clark is an artist who was born in New Orleans in 1926, continues to live and work in New York. And this is the New Orleans series painting that we have in the museum, where there are also works by Joan Mitchell. And the two of them were very, very close and lived in Europe and painted studios near each other in the late 40s, early 50s. And Alma Thomas, part of the process, I guess, of these type of exhibitions is often the sort of search for artists that you feel like have not been seen enough, and Alma Thomas is one of those. Also born at the end of the 19th century, kind of gets lumped in with Washington Color School, but she's older than all of them, I believe. And artists like Ken Noland and Sam Gilliam. And she's part of that conversation, but definitely had her own thing. And so we had three paintings from three different decades. And then again, the New Orleans Museum of Art happened to own one painting, so it made it perfect. Huguette Colon was one of the biggest surprises to me for the exhibition. Artist who was born in Lebanon, still living, left to go to Paris in the 60s, and sort of left her family and was working in fashion, and then dedicated herself full-time to painting and sculpture. Has an exhibition that just opened last week at Lombard Freed Gallery in New York. Also for me, was the crazy surprise was, happened to live in Venice for like 15 years. I was like, right down the street. So they asked me if I wanted to do a studio visit, and I'm thinking, where am I going to do studio visit? And it turned out to be 20 minutes away. So she lived here and was quite active. Like, the house is there, kids are moving into the house. There was work by all of the Southern California artists we've shown recently, Ed Moses, John Altoon, all in the house. She did some collaborative work with Moses, and I've seen some of the abstractions that she did later, like in the time she was here in the 80s and 90s, in people's collections, and never made the connection. She made this figurative work, these bodyscapes, in the early 70s and late 60s. And so that's what's on view in our show and what Lombard Freed is showing. So it was another one of those huge surprises. Jeffrey Gibson. And this is the artist that it's sort of, we talked a lot about that MoMA conversation. A lot of his work, well, he did a full-on installation at Participant in New York maybe 2-3 years ago, that specifically used the 1941 Native American art show at MoMA as inspiration and as physical design. And a lot of his work comes out of that conversation and updating some of these works that are part of more antique collections. Zarina Bimji. Within the idea, I think, of seeing each other, I personally can find it in each and every work and feel like each thing is pivotal. And I know that gets diffuse at points throughout the exhibition. Zarina Bimji is an artist who, born in Uganda, has lived and worked in London for many years. Her family, she's Indian and was part of a group of people who were asked to physically leave Uganda by Idi Amin. So this idea of her sort of recovering oneself has always been a part or a conversation of her work. And this is not a still from Waiting. We ended up using this piece, Waiting, from 2007, because she was working on a brand new piece in Kenya. And all of the work, like this image, is about the landscape of East Africa. And is very poetic, very moving, very atmospheric film and video installations. But the piece that she was working on for the show, the last year has been so tough there politically that, while she was there trying to film, she was asked to leave. So that conversation and that idea, I think, of how the present impinged upon certain things was very much a part of the exhibition. Everybody knows and loves Charles Gaines. Skybox, if you didn't see it, Suzanne Villemetter. It's the same piece that was there 2 years ago, and it was at Paula Cooper last year. And he's using texts that go back to the 17th century, like first evidence or text pertaining to civil disobedience in England. And then it goes on to a Frantz Fanon quote and a Ho Chi Minh quote. And with Charles, that idea of what is underneath or what is under the surface is so important. You experience this work as on a time lapse, and so the room is dark, and what you're looking at is almost a pure night sky. And when the room becomes lit, you begin to make out these important texts. David Zinke is an artist who I think uses music as subject matter for communication. So you have this dual projection video in which these Afro-Cuban performers are almost having a call and response type of conversation. Another one of the sort of significant video installations in the show. And Glenn Kaino, another LA artist. And this is a huge piece. I mean, the one on the right gives you a close-up. The one on the left is more a sketch of an original idea, but essentially we have a series of tanks that are filled with these coral that are innately, they try to take over each other's land, if you will. So they try to take over each other's space and became this metaphor for people, obviously. Sophie Leboff is an artist who is from New York but lives in New Orleans and provided, I think, a very interesting way of thinking about the real visual space. She's also the artist that pointed me towards the moviegoer. She actually has made a series of photographs that relate to different neighborhoods that are talked about in that book. But also, I think in this case, serving as a catalyst for a conversation around Southern photography and around people like Eggleston and William Christenberry, Walker Evans, that the work is a part of that landscape and a part of that conversation. Pushpamala is an Indian artist who's part of a conversation that happens on the top floor of the Contemporary Art Center, which I think begins in a sort of more minimalist, more abstract way on the bottom floor, and then it has those representational images by Sophie and another artist named Douglas Bourgeois on the second floor, and then on the third floor goes away from the space of New Orleans to a much more international conversation. She made a series of pieces that all take off from 70s film and older paintings in which she's inserting herself into these histories. It also made for an interesting conversation with an artist named Peter Hugo, who has documented figures from the Nigerian film industry, from Nollywood, with this artist Pushpamala, who is using Bollywood as a historical archive. Kerry James Marshall, we have nothing like this in the exhibition. Why do a painting with Kerry in this space? Instead, he did a window installation in a neighborhood called Central City, which is one of the more crime-ridden kind of neighborhoods in the city. And so it's not a painting at all, but this is for the sake of the conversation. Mary Ellen Carroll did one of several pieces that were quite site-specific in nature, and that she was trying to provide Wi-Fi for people who, believe it or not, do not have access to Wi-Fi. Particularly in a neighborhood that is separated by the Interstate 10, which went basically through the heart in the late 70s, early 80s, through the heart of like a really vibrant community there, and a community that is still lacking a lot of infrastructure. And so it really was about that sort of giving something. William Cordova is an artist that I've worked with several times and knew that he was a part of the conversation, and he ended up doing this collaborative piece with his Soul Rebels band. It's hard to make out here, but they are facing the statue of Robert E. Lee, which is right down the street from two of the main exhibition spaces, the Contemporary Art Center and the Ogden Museum, which is where the Basquiat show was. So that north-south conversation in a very, very localized way, although much of his work is about it in a much more international way. And also hinting at how much music was a part of a lot of the installations. William chose to be at Dillard University, which is a small historically black school it's the closest to the lake, as they say in New Orleans, as opposed to saying north. And Terry Atkins is an artist whose work is in the collection there, who died last year, and William wanted to be a part of that conversation. So that happens there. Much of his work was about the duality between the art object and its utilitarian self outside of just a presentational space. So those drums that you see hanging up on the wall have been played in performance. Lord William. Los Jai-Chakras, and this is an ice sculpture that they did at Miami Basel last year at the Perez Art Museum in Miami. I'd say all of their work somehow involves histories of music, and in this case there's citing Jamaican sound systems, but for Prospect they did a piece that really took that idea of the accordion and explored it as a object traveling through the water to the New World, and it's part of a video installation that they made specifically for the show. Shigeru Ban ends up in the exhibition, although he had already done this house in 2009 as part of the Make It Right Foundation, Brad Pitt and Foundation, which was this post-Katrina thing that was set up to create new housing in the lower Ninth Ward, the neighborhood that was most severely affected by Katrina. And so he has this house here, but then we also did an installation of a body of 3 different parts of his human disaster relief structures. So he's made these tents and he's made them out of different temporary materials in Rwanda, also after the tsunami in Southeast Asia. So it's all about that, not only about New Orleans, but a really nice way to tie in the project that he had done there. And then Camille en Rose, a piece that obviously was in the last Venice Biennial, was the Silver Lion Award for the last Venice. And it's one of few things that I think I had seen where it just became apparent that it also had a different life in New Orleans. Camille did an exhibition at the New Orleans Museum of Art in the past year, in which she did a very site-specific piece in collaboration with the Homa tribe outside New Orleans. And so I felt like within the context of that conversation, it would be interesting to use this older piece as well. Pierre Willia, another LA artist. This is his Luminous Sphere, which I don't know if it's still up on the top of the Standard Hotel on Sunset, and it's supposed to light up when he's in town. Pierre was a character. We took the piece that many of you have seen at the Hammer, where he started making George Washington's gigantic nose. I think it's about 20 feet in length and like 12 feet in height. And so we have students working on it at the Delgado Community College in New Orleans now. That its life at the Hammer was part 1 and that's part 2. Another Basquiat piece that again relates specifically to the geography, this piece called Natchez. Keith Calhoun and Chandra McCormick, and I just like thinking about that idea of election and politics and this being a space for that type of conversation. Last night, Keith and Chandra, who are born and raised in New Orleans, photographers who have documented tens of thousands of images that they've taken around New Orleans over the last 30-something years, going all the way back to the late 70s and early 80s when you see this picture that was taken at Angola Prison. So to do a show there and not think about incarceration and not think about what the American prison system is, and not only American, but international prison system would be impossible. So they have pictures that go back to this one from 1980 that then go all the way to like the last couple of years. And I forget the exact numbers, but like the Louisiana incarcerated population is like bigger than small countries, and just points to, you know, the problems. Last night they had a panel conversation with Angela Davis, which really brought a lot of the issues in their work to the fore. And this is an artist named Herbert Singleton who actually learned a lot of his art-making craft, not unlike some of the people that Keith and Chandra have documented in the last few years. He learned his craft at Angola as a prisoner. And he's since passed, but this is a piece that is specifically about that prison. There's a conversation around ideas of the carnivalesque to some degree, and in this case, Hugh Locke is one of 4 artists at the Newcomb Art Space at Tulane University, along with also Munir Farman Formayan, Andrea Frazier, and Ebony Patterson, where a lot of the work, I think, references some of the carnival tradition that is so specific to New Orleans. In this case, he's making these work out of little beads. It's about a 2-week installation process that filled this entire room. The Propeller Group, I feel like it's a disservice to show this image at this point because everybody's talking about the video that they did for Prospect, which is a new piece that, again, is about this cultural sort of transmission idea. They are based in Vietnam and also in LA, but the piece uses traditional funeral rites in Vietnam as a conversation with New Orleans, and it's almost exactly the same thing. The way that music and parade are part of funerary customs is an incredible sort of parallel, and that's their videos. Carrie Mae Weems, another artist who's done a lot of work in Louisiana in particular, has a Louisiana series, but we ended up doing this relatively new piece that she made at the Mattress Factory not so long ago. And it's one of several like standalone installations. So Carrie has a series of photographs on the ground floor of a building called the McKenna, which you see there, and then a video installation upstairs. Lou Ding, this is not through service. Lou Ding is an artist who worked conceptually with this project where he was an artist who had no reference point for New Orleans at all. Like he came there, spent maybe 3 or 4 days, and was struck by the way like loitering is considered to be unlawful. The idea of actually congregating with more than, I don't know, 5, 6 people like, is considered unlawful. And so he did a series of performances that were videotaped of people loitering. And literally like in one neighborhood, near the French Quarter, you would have gawkers who were kind of like talking to the 5 or 6 guys, and they're all guys of color who are sitting and loitering. And then literally like in one neighborhood in Uptown, which is like, it's like Beverly Hills, they were called, the police were called on them. So it was a really interesting way of gauging the ways in which people react to what is an art performance. Tavares Strawn, this image does no service, but you might have seen his piece called You Belong Here. It's a 100-foot long purple neon sign that's about 15 feet high that says these words and has a very, I think, resonant place floating on the Mississippi River. This idea of who belongs to this place that before Hurricane Katrina, and I don't know why I'm referencing so much because it's really not that kind of show, but this place that had 450,000 people before that event, and really the flood is what it is, and then dropped all the way to like 300,000 shortly after. The idea of who belongs here is really important, and you see construction everywhere you go. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the country. Really amazing work that I think in terms of image and in terms of the way that it plays out on social media has been almost as important, if not more so, than the way it plays out physically. Piece that I see has a very, very different resonance on Instagram today. If you look at the Phillips Instagram feed, there's a smaller version that's going up for sale next week. Very different. Bonnie Holly is an artist who made a series of brand new installation sculptures and assemblages throughout Xavier University. Artist who is from Birmingham and is often a sort of point of conversation around ideas around self-taught, which again was a part of the conversation, but then not so much. It need not be, right? It's just the work. It's made. It's contemporary. Tamika Norris did a new piece, and which also was a very site-specific piece that related to a film installation that she made while living in New Orleans. Will Ryman is in the park right next to New Orleans Museum of Art. He also has a huge gold cabin inside the museum that was already a part of their collection, which is very much about American history. It's filled with commodities that go from the go from log cabins, I think, to the present. And so it was a nice conversational piece with not only his work inside and outside, but also America as it related to Jeffrey Gibson's installation on Native American art. And Zarumi Abdalian, the piece that she did for Prospect is even less visible than this piece here. And it's one of the most just quietest, it's a piece that she did at the New Orleans African American Museum that you can experience just by walking along the perimeter of this space. And it is a sound installation and very just sleight of hand work. And that's that. So if you want to any questions now, or I can keep.
I just have a quick question about the setup. Do you incorporate performance? I know that there's pieces that are performative in some way, especially relating to sound. and Mississippi River piece, which I assume is somewhat movable, or
Yeah.
but are there other ideas around performance or events that you tackled with this?
You know, at the beginning, I felt like, okay, it was going to be so integral, and it'll happen all the time. And then, like, as a curator who works more closely with objects, and I figured out how expensive it was to do a scheduled performance throughout the entire run of the show. And so rather than do that, we centered it around the beginning and the end, and then little things happen here and there. Gary Simmons made a very a slight intrusion to what was a vacant building that is now for performers and for people who are musicians in New Orleans to come and use the space throughout the run of the exhibition. On the opening and on the closing as well, Andrea Fraser did a piece that was, to me, like probably the best, one of the best pieces in the exhibition, in which she recounted the proceedings of a court hearing that happened in 1991 that effectively desegregated the floats for Mardi Gras. And she embodied, through just voice, 19 different characters who were in that courtroom. And you get this crazy conversation about how people feel like you can't, how can you desegregate Mardi Gras, you will ruin it. And it turned into this whole conversation that was just about the politics of that place specifically, but about something way bigger, about just people relating to each other. So the question of performance became one of how to integrate it, and that was the way that it, I think, played out most effectively, which is tough, because like we squeezed maybe 350 into her performance, and then that's that. I don't know how to feel.
Franklin, can I just ask two things? One, the Angela Davis talk, was that prompted from the artists in terms of talking about prison, or was that, or like just, I guess is following up to the prior question, was that organized? I mean, that just seems like a really interesting event that the exhibition could offer the city without it being, you know, generated by artists doing something that's performative. So I'm just kind of trying to get, can you explain how that one came about and how that went?
Yeah, I mean, you know, a lot of the process and like part of it is you know, working with people who you have some idea that they're going to take it to some other place that you can't imagine. And I could not have imagined that one. I know their work from the past. They also worked closely with Mark Bradford on the first Prospects, where they opened a space called L9 for Lower Ninth, which is a space for photography that continues to exist and present work. And but they took it upon themselves.
That's great.
You know, like I gave them space, and I gave them the institution they wanted, and they figured that out. And I think that happened a lot, and that was part of the point of like, for me being there and having that sort of relationship.
So my second question to that would be, when you look at the exhibition and its history, and I'm thinking back to everything from the staging of Waiting for Godot to now, or things like that, do you see it as a uniquely regional show in terms of its, and region being southern, like being broader to, or a broad discussion for the region itself to deal with issues, or do you see it really as national, international? I mean, I mean that from an on-the-ground standpoint, like where is the work being done in terms of the activity and the dialogue around the show? Does it feel like it's outsiders feeling like they're doing some good by being there, or is it actually affecting things on the ground?
And my hope and my desire, and I think that it happened, was that there was the perfect balance. There are artists who were born in New Orleans who don't live there anymore. There are artists who live there but are not from there. So there are several of them that brought a sense of place that I could never bring. And yet, you know, there are artists from all over the world at the same time. But there are also those connections, like I mentioned the Propeller Group. Like, there's a huge Vietnamese population in New Orleans. And so, you know, we knew certain things were ripe to happen, and then artists made it happen. I believe that it's an international exhibition taking off from Dan's foundation and mission point, and that's the conversation that we're trying to have. And that all those artists, you know, whether they're born and raised in New Orleans or representing New Orleans, are a part of that conversation just as much as they're a part of the New Orleans conversation.
And the audience, you feel, is?
Well, you know, I just came from opening weekend, so it's like you have an interesting contrast. Like the first weekend is a very big international kind of audience, and then I imagine it becomes a more New Orleans base for a little while until the end. We also have a program in the middle of December that is solely focused on a conference around Robert Farris Thompson's book, Flash of the Spirit, which was his 20th anniversary was last year, or 30th anniversary was last year. So that's a 2-day conference that will bring in 100 scholars in addition to whatever other people. And then the closing will also hopefully do a similar thing. But really tried to have that balance. And I'm not showing images because I don't have them yet of like, Lisa Siegel did an installation in 2 different very, very, very tough neighborhoods with a lot of abandoned buildings in which she worked directly with participants, neighborhood people, and did a visual thing on these abandoned houses. So there was a lot of that too, and there were a lot of artists that spent a lot of more time there than I did. The other thing, like to the regional conversation, there's a big conversation happening between the Wassan Al-Qadari, who's an amazing curator who just started at the Birmingham Museum about 6 months ago. Miranda Lash, who was at the New Orleans Museum of Art and worked with me at the Manila in Houston, is now in Louisville. And also Trevor Schoolmaker, who is the head of the Nasher at Duke. And they're actually working on a regional type exhibition right now. But I talk to them a lot in the process as well. Yeah, they might.
Yeah.
I mean, the Best Off Sculpture Garden is a part of NOMA, which you're referring to. And it's the Best Off that bought the big log cabin that's inside. So I would not be surprised if it stayed there. But yeah, it was perfect sighting.
Yeah.
So I don't know what's in here, but it relates more to LACMA. I haven't looked at it in a little while. I started at LACMA in, God, it's been 5 years already. 5 years as of the end of this year. And I guess this is like the fun thing is trying to figure out, well, what is it? Like, what is the contemporary collection? And one means of trying to do that fortunately happened very early on was the opportunity to do this show that became titled Human Nature. I think we started in 2011, so I started beginning in 2010 at the museum and brought a couple of exhibitions from the Manil. One of them was Steve Wolf, who works on paper exhibition, and the other was via Sirmans, which was obviously so perfect. And not only was it via Sirmans, but it was the work from 1964 to 1966 that she made while she was at, for the most part, while she was at UCLA. And so then, you know, in the process of having those two come in 2010, it gave a little bit of time to think about the difference and what does this space mean. Working at the Manil, I was one of 2 curators, 2 senior curators. I was, the job was anything that had to do with the Western canon was all mine. And I worked with a woman who Christina Van Dyke, a specialist in African art and anything on Western, all hers. And so it's just like, you go into the meeting, you're like, I want to move this Picasso over here by this African sculpture. All you know, it happens. And it happens so fast. And I don't know how many of you have seen the Manil, but it's much smaller than Blackmore. It's, God, I think it's even smaller than the Resnick. And it's the first building that Resopiano did in this country in 1987. And like the Resnick, it more or less, all of the installation space is all on one floor. So it's very simple. It's not like the Broad building, which is, I think, can be difficult and interesting at times. The rooms feel more cavernous. It's hard to find a degree of intimacy in those spaces sometimes. In the Resnick, you can move things around, make things happen in a very much easier way, which you're all going to see in a few weeks when you see the Pierre Huyghe installation, which I walked into for the first time and didn't even recognize the space at all. And you'll see how brilliantly flexible that building is in terms of presentation space. So coming from there, and a collection that is built off of its eclecticism, one that is not built off of its, and is not so well known for its contemporary collection, one where you have to be very, very specific about what you do in terms of contemporary and how it relates to the broader sections of the museum, which entail a huge collection of African and Oceanic, and a very big collection of Byzantine. So you had to be really aware of that relationship. Obviously, with us in encyclopedic, there are big areas of many different places. But so human nature became this way of trying to figure out, well, what is the base here? And this work by Bruce Nauman, Human Nature Like Death, Knows Doesn't Know, became the sort of piece that drove that conversation. I think one of the opposite things that I find about the contemporary collection at LACMA, as opposed to the Manil, and the foundation of the Manil is about in-depth. It's very much a Dia concept, not for nothing. It's the same family. The daughter of the founders of the Manil collection, one of their daughters was a co-founder of Dia. So this relationship that they have with Magritte is like them having a relationship with their best friend. And so they have it's the biggest collection of Magritte in the United States, and probably second only to the collection in Brussels. Yves Klein, same thing. Not as big, but the biggest collection in the United States. And those are direct relationships that they brought with them from Europe. They then, of course, hired Walter Hopps, born in Eagle Rock, to be the founding director in the mid-'80s. And his imprint becomes known, I think, in the way that he related to that European foundation. So in terms of photography, where you have somebody like Cartier-Bresson, biggest collection of Cartier-Bresson in the United States, Walter then built off of that and created one of the biggest collections around Walker Evans. And there's an interesting conversation that happens there. So just thinking about collecting in such different ways. Rothko, same thing. Twomey, Chamberlain, same thing. And once you get past those artists, it becomes very diffuse. Not unlike LACMA, where you have a very strong collection of artists from Southern California, but then things become a lot more diffuse. One of the few artists where we actually have work across 4 different decades, and I'll say we probably have one across each of those decades, is Nauman. Going back to like an early video, the corridor piece, where he's driving his body through the corridor, I think it's 65, to a couple of drawings from the 70s, and an early fiberglass piece, which you should see in the installation, to this piece from the 80s, and then of course to our 2010 piece, which has been on the first floor for the last 2 years and is coming down actually in a couple of weeks, the big piece with the hands. And I'd say across, maybe with the exception of the neon, but across all of those pieces, he's doing one thing, which is how do I make something out of nothing, just me in the studio. This, quite different, but going a part of that conversation. So I guess at LACMA it was, well, how do you distinguish, since you don't keep a contemporary as a big unfolding exhibition up at all times, the way that you do in modern, at least modern as we stretch its definition to, I don't know what's the most recent thing in there now, but Gober was in there not too long ago, which is kind of weird. That you try to make some sort of conversation between those galleries that end predominantly on Southern California pop, Ruche, well, not even Southern California. You got the Ruche in there, you got Lichtenstein in there, you got the Warhol in there, at least you could say it was from the Ferris show in 1962, the soup can, and then it's a hodgepodge around it. So it sort of gives you the sense, if you walk out of that space, that something odd is happening, or we don't know where to go from there. And so we were trying to think of ways in which to continue that conversation. For the sake of the conversation at LACMA, 1968 is the crossing point in which if something is being acquired and it's from 1968, then it'll go through the Department of Modern Art. If it's from 68 or after, it'll go through Contemporary. But I think the last real nucleus room in modern for me is the abstract expressionist room. And even in there, you have a singular piece. You don't see anybody in depth. So you get a wonderful still on one wall. You get a wonderful early Chamberlain. You get Montauk Highway by de Kooning. You get a wonderful Frank Stella. But you just said one. And then you got Stella next to like Pistoletto, which is taking us in a whole other space too. So how do we deal with that thing has been something that we've been trying to deal with a lot for the last few years. And Nauman became a good focal point for that conversation simply because the work spread across those time periods. And also involved this idea of that could be the difference between those galleries is that, you know, so much of the work at post-68 becomes involved in issues of conceptualism or issues of performance in the body. And so we started off, and I say we, myself and Christine Kim, co-curated the exhibition together. We've worked together many times and collaborated a lot at the Studio Museum in Harlem, where she was prior to coming to LACMA. So in this room, and forgive me, the images are all over the place. A Conchi on the left, in this piece where he's being kissed all over his body. A very early 68 David Hammond's watercolor of a peace sign, a hand holding a peace sign, and next to that, one of the more famous pieces from the contemporary collection, Injustice Case from 1971 by David Hammond, in which he's acting out Bobby Seale during the Chicago 8 trial, and Seale was handcuffed behind his back. And then it's filled in with this American flag as a framing device. And then Nauman holograms from the 70s, and then that early sort of fiberglass / body sculpture piece. So this idea that, okay, there's a different conversation happening, and let's try to make it as apparent and as abrupt as possible. The Nauman corridor piece is on a monitor on the floor to the left. And you can see it there. And then also that the conversation widens and that, you know, I'm pretty sure all of the artists, at least in that abstract expressionist room, are probably all white, they're probably all male, probably all working in the United States. But that the conversation becomes bigger on the other side of 68 as well. So you have works by Linda Benglis, Hannah Wilkie, and then the idea that the conversation is not only rooted in those more historical works, but that for us, it's got to be a conversation what's happening now. And so there's a Carly Fernandez piece in between Hannah Wilkie and Ana Mendieta in the corner. And this idea that those issues or ideas are just as prevalent in the present as they were then. Charles Gaines' graph piece to the right of Mendieta. There's the Injustice Case. That's in his traveling show now. That's starting to do the museum now. And then, likewise, going from, yes, a room of performative, inflected, and at least body-referenced type of work to, oh, and the hems, of course, is a body print, to a room of more minimal objects, but also in conversation with the present. So you have a Larry Bell cube, which actually is from 1967, just to try and hint at the idea that these things make no sense and that they're so arbitrary. In front of the Silhouette, one of his classic wall drawings, and a piece that has been shown several times in different places. A piece that's made from rules and can be in two different places at the same time. It was nice at the time that we had the work up. It was also up at Mass MoCA. So this idea of the artwork, of course, not being so precious anymore and not being so object-based, but can exist in different ways. And then a wonderful Judd bronze over on the right. And on the floor is actually, I think for some people, you might hope they walk into the room and think that the floor piece is a Carl Andre, and then they get on top of it, and it's actually Doris Salcedo piece that's made out of these little stainless steel pins, which she calls, and it's a piece she calls prayer mat. So it would be a very painful prayer mat. It has a compass at the middle pointing towards Mecca. So a host of other issues that would not necessarily be part of the conversation with Bell, Judd, or even LeWitt. And there's another view of that room, another Judd on the far wall. And on the right is actually a Gary Hume that you can't see very well, so also trying to make some connection between the present and the past in terms of the color, form, composition that happens with these works. 66. And a beautiful Fred Sandback piece. And we have, one Fred Sandback, but it's fantastic. And then a room that was kind of sort of about assemblage and about trying to have a conversation about a history of assemblage peculiar to Los Angeles. This has also happened to be up at the same time that Ed Keenholz's big 5-car stud piece was up over on the other side of campus. A big assemblage installation that was part of the 1972 Documenta, which is very much a tough Keenholz piece, even tougher than the ones that are usually up in the galleries. It's a piece that was up during Pacific Standard Time that was about castration, actually, and about race in America at that time. But it's a conversation, I think the Keenholz conversation, for me, translated in this room with a piece, again, I apologize, but you're going to see a lot more of him next year. A piece on the left by Noah Purifoy. It's a work called Last Supper. And Purifoy came here from Alabama in the late 50s, worked in furniture, went to Chenard. Soon after that, married his love of social work with his interest in the arts, and was the first director at the Watts Towers Art Center. And then in 1966 or 65, when the Watts riots happened, he made a huge piece called 66 Signs of Neon, which actually was shown through different places around the country in 67 and 68, and happened to be organized in part by Walter Hopps, who of course was very close to Ed Keenholz. Walter Hopps, when he moved from Pasadena in the mid-60s to Washington, D.C., the first exhibition he did was Keenholz. The second exhibition he did was Noam Purifoy. So one of the few people that has actually talked about that conversation, which we hope to talk about more next year in the show. So try to at least hint at some of those conversations while, of course, making a big selection type exhibition. There's an Alison Saar work to, I don't know, on the left. That's Dario Robledo with these big elephant tusks. In the middle, who has nothing to do with LA, but a lot to do with assemblage and a lot to do with sort of mystery and creative fiction. A lot of his work is about this sort of belief in alchemy, if you will, and taking objects that have a relationship to history. And then in the foreground is assemblage by Rachel Harrison. And then John Outerbridge, the truck, and the mask behind it. And Outerbridge was a very close friend and almost student of Noah Purifoy. So there's that conversation happening. Alison Sarr's mother is Betty Sarr, who was very close to Purifoy, and a part of a conversation that goes back to the 1960s. And all those three artists were all a part of Now Dig This, which was also up at the same time at the Hammer as part of Pacific Standard Time. So none of this to enjoy the presentation, but it's all happening at the same time. You can make out in the background, I think that's Mauricio Catalan, little mini elevators. Another view, there was George Herms in that assemblage room, and an artist whose name I'm forgetting next to him on the black painting. And there's Rachel Harrison. Betty was outside of view, so she was in the same room as her daughter and those other artists that she was so close to. A wonderful piece here that actually was denied for my Neo Hoodoo show. I don't know why. No, it's in the Lackman collection. And then a room that centered on ideas of text in particular. And again, mixing that up completely. So you have the Nauman in that room. You have a Baldessari in that room next to Joseph Kossuth's definition of thing, and Glenn Ligon's Rukin figure, which is one of the earlier American neons that he did with it reading backwards, is also in that room. Glenn spoke a lot about his own entry into working with neon through Bruce Nauman, and that being a sort of inspiration for that conversation. Obviously, his text-based work has a lot to do with Kossuth and Baldessari. And the Mel Bachner was in that room. So again, like Mel Bachner, we don't have a lot of work, but we got a great piece that gets requested for loans all the time, just like the David Hammonds. And I think, if anything, that has been like one of the foundational strands that we've tried to build off of is, if you're not going to have the whole shebang, then have the right thing. So like Chris Burden, you know, whenever Mocha's got a bunch of stuff, but come on, Metropolis, Urban Light, you can't understand Burden if you don't come to LACMA. Irwin, you know, we have he's done a lot of the Getty, but we have our Palm Garden, which goes throughout the entire site. Michael Heiser. Gotta come see Levitated Mass if you care about Heiser. So we tried to think about some aspects of the collection in that way, like to really think pivotally and singularly about certain pieces, which is what everybody does, but I think in many cases to take that further. And you know, the LACMA's been at that campus since 1965. And was over here before that as part of the Natural History Museum. But as an initiative around contemporary art, and since we already mentioned Walter Hobbs, you know, it's not, obviously, as you guys know, it's not that old. And so as an encyclopedic museum with contemporary, I think we're working from a different playing field in Chicago than New York, or even Houston, the MFA for that matter. We have a lot more work in the modern collection than we might have. So it's a really open sense of possibility, thus also our concentration on film and video in particular, because I think we can really sort of lead the way on that conversation in a way that we're not going to be able to recuperate on certain other things. You know, there's one Jasper Johns in that gallery, and I think there are only two in the whole collection. Installation, particularly video-based, in this sort of fifth room, you have Namjoon Pak, and again, Pak, we have one really good piece. It's this video flag from 1984, and it's one of 3 that he did around that time. A piece in which you see the flickering sort of the 84 different television monitors in creating this flag. In the corner is a William Kentridge, and then on the left an Alfredo jar, which point us in the direction of more of an international conversation, perhaps away from the conversation around Southern California artists. 86. And their Catalan elevator. And we do have 3 Catalans in the collection. And another room, so after those sort of 4 or 5 kind of points of reference to jump off of, a room of material. So Do Ho Suh's Gate from 2005, and we do have a very strong initiative around Korean art. We spend around $250,000 every year on contemporary Korean as part of a grant with the cosmetics company, Amori Pacific. And some of that is also, I think, jumping off of an exhibition that happened at LACMA in 2009 called Your Bright Future, which was a show about Korean contemporary art, and Do Ho was a part of that. So we've acquired works by Do Ho Suh, Hae-Gu Yang, Lee Woo, Yi Suk Yang, all within the last few years. Kim Soo-ja, Choi Jang-hwa. So and also represent, thinking of the fact that there are more Koreans in Los Angeles than there are any other place in the world outside of Korea, that there is this conversation, and so it's one that has been happening. But in this room, the piece is playing a role as a very ethereal object made out of silk in conversation with, say, Alighiero Boetti, who's also sewing in this case, in his collaborative mappa painting that was made with women in Afghanistan. I don't know if I have a bigger image of the piece, but it's one of those pieces that also serves as a chronological, timepiece. You can kind of see how big the red is on the right, and that's Russia for that time, which of course doesn't exist that way anymore. The flag in South Africa in that painting is completely different now. So it's this marker of time. On the far wall, Zhang Wan, an ash painting made from found ashes at a temple in Shanghai. And then peeking through the gate is a beautiful wood sculpture by Martin Purrier. There's a beautiful piece. Boetti, only one, but one of the best map paintings you can find. Gerhard Richter, we have 2 Richters in the collection, but I think they both do the job. This piece, 48 Portraits, you see it here in the bridge area, which is a really strange sort of space that we try to program in between the 2 sides of the Broad building. In this case, this piece it stems from a painting that he did as part of his installation for the 1972 Documenta, where he showed these portraits of his influential figures. You can make out, I think Einstein is in there, Kafka's in there. His sort of grand statement, which was the only piece he did for that German pavilion that year. And I don't know how, I forget how it came about, but it's a work he revisited with an edition of 4 photographic pieces. And so we're one of 4 institutions that actually have this piece. And then a few Franz West chairs just to suggest a sort of pause space, which is what this was. Before moving into a space of painting with Kerry James Marshall, who lived here, studied here, was a student of Charles White, and then of course Larry Pittman on the other side, and those two in conversation with friends like a little Kehinde Wiley on the left, Marlene Dumas, a great painting that was in Connie Butler's Mocha traveling show. A little tiny Luc Tuymans painting that was recently in an exhibition at the Menil. Michael Boromans and a Elizabeth Payton. So a room of representation and figuration. And then the Hegu Yang occupied one of the biggest exhibition spaces on the second side of the floor, because this was the whole second floor. So this piece doubles in couples, which also comes out of the conversation around Korean art that was curated by Lynn Zelavansky, who the piece came in honor of her. And in this work, Hegu was taking these appliances and household objects and using just their form as sculptural components in this installation. Better view surrounded by Leslie Hewitt's photographs. And then coming back to LA again, if we began in LA, we tried to end in LA a little bit. So Mark Rochon's 2005 painting on the right, that is up at the museum now. A little hanging Elliot Hundley, and then Mark Bradford, which is also up right now. Early piece from 2003. And I think all of those came in through what is called the Art Here and Now program, which is a way for us to extend the foundation around Southern California artists, and specifically geared every year to acquiring work by younger artists, most specifically in LA. So that's how a lot of that work came in. Amanda Ross Ho, to mess up that room a little bit, put us on a little bit different footing, and Alexandra Grant painting. And then ending with Jack Pearson, Friedrich Kuhnow, Liz Kraft, and Hannah Taylor. And I think that's it for Human Nature, and we're getting close on time, so I don't know if you guys don't have any conversations, and I can run through other LACMA things, but I think you get the gist. It's a different space, and it's a different way of working.
Yeah, we should probably have a few minutes for questions that will tell you, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to? Actually, kind of sponsor, sometime we do it. The painting show that you just also mounted right before New Orleans, also from the collection. Do you have a couple? I saw it, so I don't want to return to it, but I'm interested in doing that. Also, at the same time, when you're doing this huge thing, I don't know, what was the feelings about trying to accomplish those two big things?
Luckily I was co-curated with Nancy Meyer on Variations, which actually began with the title Doubt, which didn't work out, but it gives you an indication of how.
Oh, what it was Doubt, and now it's Variations.
So it was great because of balance, like dealing on one hand with you guys, living artists, and all kinds of stuff happening on the phone in New Orleans, and like
the real specific,
the real hardcore, and then being able to deal with something that is more about you and the object, layout, working with exhibition design, and which I like a lot, like I like both. So it was a good balance. It was also nice to be working on Noah Purifoy at the same time. Artist no longer here. Historical project for me, I never knew him, removed, detached. So in a way it provided a really nice balance. And for us, like, I think one of the things that we've been able to do with Michael is like to be a little bit nimble for being such a big museum. Like, we put this exhibition together in like 6 to 8 months, I think. Same thing, I did a show that was in the same space right before this, which was Football, a Beautiful Game. So we've had time to be able to work that way too. and then to sit back and do other projects with books that are a little bit longer term. So I found the balance to be really refreshing. We started off with doubt in terms of the exhibition because I think one of the things we wanted to do was address some of the things that you guys must be grappling with in terms of painting in general and thinking about, you know, what is interesting, especially when the market seems to dominate this freaking conversation so much right now. And so doubt was more a reference to the conversation around a lot of abstract painting in particular. And I'll tell you one scary thing that I guess one of the phrases in that conversation on the doubt side is zombie formalism. So I can't believe I'm telling you this. So Roberta Smith wrote this piece last week. I can't remember the painter. The paintings were from like the 70s. Beautiful, lyrical, geometric, super saturated, and she referred to it how good it was in the wake of so much zombie formalism. And I got a message from Maurice Tuckman, and he said, your show reminded me of zombie formalism. Do you know who Maurice Tuckman is?
Yeah.
He was the curator of LACMA in the 70s and 80s, and basically the foundation of the contemporary art collection. So that was kind of scary because we thought we were doing completely the opposite. And I would still, I hope so. It was an email. It was an email, right? It had to be, right? I never got a reply.
I'll try to read the tone.
Yeah, forward it.
I'm gonna say it was. But so it became also apparent in that conversation was like, we're an institution and we only get what we love, and we only have what we love. So it was hard to partake so much in that conversation. So what we did was we sprinkled these quotes that allude to conversations around abstraction and representation. One is from Helen Molesworth that relates to an Amy Stillman painting. One is an Alfred Barr from like 1931 where he's saying almost the same thing. Like the differences between abstraction and representation are this big. And Helen was saying something very similar. And then another one where Holland Cotter talks about the importance of representation vis-a-vis these works. So, you know, to widen the conversation, because that's the thing, it's like, it was a show that was based off of the collection, and in the last 3 years, we've been so fortunate with so much work coming into the collection that it was like, we can do one show that, Rita would do one show called Lost Line that explores geography, that can jump off of different things for her. Human nature was one thing. So to think specifically around abstraction was a way to highlight some of these works and then also to partake in a bigger conversation. And we brought in historical work, thus the other Richter that's in the collection is this St. Andrew painting, which is wonderful, which we built the wall. If you see the installation, we built the wall specifically for this painting to be the first thing that you see as you walk in and to suggest those ties between abstraction and representation. This piece was in a show at Dauphin Gallery in London in 1988, in which he showed a series of paintings that also come from the Saint appellation, which relates to chapels in London. And he showed them on one side of the room, and down on the other side of the room were the blurred landscapes. And so you have this very conscious conversation, and what you see is that the blurring of his abstract picture is just the same thing. It's like, can you make an abstract painting from a photograph? And that seems to be what he's doing. It looks like it's a stopped action painting almost. And so that was the first thing when you enter into the exhibition. And also allows us to tie into histories around German art that Stephanie Barron has been so much a part of for such a long time that, you know, we're the museum where you had German expression as part of Germany's degenerate art. So we have a very strong foundation there, and that's really where you enter into the modern collection. Unlike other encyclopedic collections, you start off with the Schwitters. So it's kind of cool, and also then another tie into a historical LA conversation that goes back to, say, Amundsen's and their interest in Schwitter's and Bauhaus and Hobbes's interest in that, all of which is somehow related. I could keep going.
So you mentioned a little bit Korea, but I was wondering if there were other like cities, countries, or provincial scenes that you saw as having like a special conversation with LA right now, or a special like synchronicity.
I don't know. LA leads the conversation in so many ways. Like, not for nothing, there's another show about abstract painting right now at MoMA. And I think 4 or 5 of the artists in the show, a dozen, are from LA. So with this exhibition, we were very much thinking of that. There are 4 works by Analia Saban, there are 3 works by Sterling Ruby, 3 works by Mark Radford, and 4 works by Mark Roach. Most of those artists are represented in that other show, but not the way that we can do it. We actually have, you know, the 2002 next to the 2013. So my feeling is that everything is kind of happening in the air here that it frees me up in a way to look for it's an international conversation. While we still have the Art Here Now program, we also have a stream of funding that is for international art. So, I don't know, recent acquisitions include Iga Suwage, an artist from Indonesia. It's really a range.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there are other places that are so resonant in that way.
I guess just talking about like regional conversations and like putting kind of like that networking idea of like you have what's going on, say in New Orleans, and to put that in an international context creates all these different conversations.
Yeah, I just find like this place is so big and there's so many schools that you just have all of the conversations are there.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like the gift and the curse in a way. It's like, there's so much good work, you know, you're trying to figure out from all of these great schools at the same time as we're also the encyclopedic museum. So, you know, I don't have to do what the Hammer does. I don't have to do what MoCA does, which I think is a little bit more grounded in that conversation now. For me, and you raised a wonderful point that I didn't mention, is that so much of the contemporary collection is also based on it's resonant with other parts of the museum. So when we did Ai Weiwei, we had this circle, the Zodiac Circle, in the middle of the plaza. And then we also happened to own a set of little porcelain antiquities, Zodiac, from the 18th century, which is the exact same thing that he was looking at to make his piece. That comes from the Summer Palace outside Beijing. So it's those kind of connections become super, super important. And then there are other more random things, like because of certain collectors who were here in LA in the past, we have a huge collection of South and Southeast Asian. Thus, Iga Suwage is a part of that conversation, and Tengwi Harso is a part of that conversation. So we have room to build off of it in a contemporary sense. And you also have curators in those departments who don't have, you know, they can make those leaps and they can go from the antiquity part to the contemporary part. So like Linda Komarov in Art of the Middle East is one of the most active collectors of contemporary at any American institution of Art of the Middle East. And therefore we have a lot more work than most encyclopedic museums in that regard. So we're trying to build off of that conversation. So as much as she's collecting there, it's also an important part for us because of the relationship. That is our raison d'etre as much as art and film, as much as film and video.
That made me think of, we have time.
One more.
Just about, we mentioned resonance between like different collections of the museum, that made me think of the new AMPAS project was planned for the Fairfax side or that corner. So like, what if you foresee, or what kind of relationship do you think that's going to generate?
It's generating. See those pictures from the gallery?
I did not.
No.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I say that because on some ways it can be a little bit superficial, but the ties are actually really close, and because of the personnel are going to become more and more apparent. I like that right now there's an installation of Hollywood costume that gives you an idea of curatorial design that is so different than anything we would possibly imagine. It's these costumes from films from the last century, and just, not like bells and whistles or anything, but like, there's a lot of video, there's audio. It's just a different means of experiencing a museum space, and I think it can be quite complementary. We started the Art and Film Gala now 4 years ago with the idea that there is this synergy, and we've made probably like 20 acquisitions in the last 4 years that are geared toward that synergy. I would go back to probably most significantly Christian Marclay's The Clock, where you have very specifically an artist who's taking the images from Hollywood and making something else out of it. Who else? Steve McQueen, who, when I brought Static to the board meeting 2 years ago, nobody knew who Steve McQueen was. And now it's like, oh yeah, I know. Those kind of connections, Pierre Weed is opening in part in that conversation. We recently got a Pierre Weed piece, and it's another one that relates specifically to that conversation, like the Markley, where it's a piece that he did, and I'm forgetting the title, that he did after Dog Day Afternoon, where he went and had Sal, the character in the movie, reenact his part in the movie, but also as not only as an actor embodying the role again, but also as an outsider, and telling him what was happening on the set. And then there's posters that relate specifically to the film. What was the big Austrian pavilion at the last Venice? Right? Palermo. We just bought that piece, and the piece is modeled after early Hollywood film and early animation. So there are these works that relate super specifically, and then I say there's a tie that keeps it in the conversation. Like Camille on Road, we actually acquired that piece, the Grossvadige piece from the last Venice, and that's part of that conversation as well. So I think there's an interesting ground for us in that space, and it's not being done at another encyclopedic museum in a way that we're going to be able to do it. And with that relationship to Hollywood that's already there, you go to the top of BCAM, you see the Hollywood sign, but now also with that museum there as well, it will be, and I think you'll see it'll become even more apparent. The pairings have been interesting. Most recently, we honored Barbara Kruger and Quentin Tarantino.
I want to conclude, but I want to quickly announce we have an opening tonight in the gallery, in case anyone wants to come, a new show, and a panel on prison abolition down at 1 Arm. So those are two things I forgot to announce. Thank you, Franklin, for being here so much.